Scary Reddit Stories Part 74. I have a friend who is a trail ranger. Basically a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands with another actual ranger. The other ranger wasn't feeling well, so he said he was going to head back as it's a 1-hour ATV ride. Friend finished up the last one when he heard voices. Keep in mind he's far off the beaten path. He called out and no one replied. It was getting dark, so he started to head back and found out that his ATV wouldn't start. He then noticed that the battery was not connected anymore. He reconnected it and started to drive, but it wasn't going fast at all. Less than half a mile later the whole thing died. He radioed back basically saying, "Hey guys, I need someone to come pick me up." They told him yes, but it would take an hour. He asked if the other guy got back, and they said no. He settled down and started a small fire, but it didn't take long before he heard voices again. It's now dark and the voices are creeping him out. It sounds like an argument, like someone was angry and yelling at someone else who sounded more scared. He called out and asked if anyone needed help. The voices didn't seem to care. He decides to walk towards the voices, but as he was getting closer the voices seemed to be getting further and further away. After 20 minutes he gave up and walked back. He got a radio call and they said the other guy was found passed out covered in vomit and was being taken to the hospital. Then the radio died. Then the voices came back. Scared out of his mind he decided to listen to what they were arguing about, picking up things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take. I don't effing care, you knew better," and so on. His guess was two hunters arguing over a kill. Then he heard one shout something, then silence, then bang. A gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that he heard nothing, just his breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything, and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours and found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour a shallow grave was found, and in it was a long dead man who had clearly been shot in the face. The creepy thing was that it was a skeleton who had been there for years. So either the argument he heard just ended with a bang and both parties went home, or he heard the murder of someone from years ago.
My brother hasn't left his room for 2 months. After I opened his door, I found out why. I hate talking about it with people. It annoys me how my brother acts. He was the worst brother I could ever ask for. That is, until I opened his door. Throughout both of our childhoods, we were inseparable. We played and hung out together all the time. Things were happy. It all changed when I was 11, when I was diagnosed with leukemia. From what I've heard, Ryan was practically forgotten by my family. My parents constantly visited me in the hospital, staying by my side during the majority of my chemotherapy. Even when they were at home with Ryan, they still only thought and talked about me. I remember my brother's face as he saw me in the hospital bed. The first time he saw me, he looked distraught. It must have been hard seeing your own sibling in a state like this. As more and more visits went on, the expression on his face had changed. His face looked hard to read, almost like he had something on his mind. I didn't think much of it at the time. Thankfully, I quickly went into remission and have been cancer-free for around 5 years. The whole family was thrilled, including Ryan. Not long after I was released from the hospital, my parents revealed to us that they were having some financial trouble and would both be having to go back to work. I was 11 and my brother was 13, so they trusted us to be home alone. I'll never forget Ryan's face when they told us. He looked absolutely crushed. It was from then on that our relationship seemed to change. Ryan became distant and withdrawn. He was quicker to anger and didn't seem to want to be around me. At the time, I figured it was part of him becoming a teenager. While this behavior continued for the next 5 years, it was only around 3 months ago when his behavior began to get stranger. It started after he finished his senior year of high school. Once summer break began, he started spending much more time in his room. His bedroom is on the basement floor of the house, so he always has his privacy. Not long after school ended, I began to notice some odd signs. I remember sitting on the couch watching television. Ryan wasn't home, and my parents were out working. When Ryan came home, he was carrying some sort of container. I couldn't tell what was inside, since it was covered by a white sheet. I asked him what it was, but he told me loud and clear that it was none of my business. He brought the mysterious container down into his bedroom. He then came back upstairs, back outside to his car, and came in with another container, still covered by a white sheet. He continued this a few more times, coming back with more covered containers. At this point I was extremely curious, but I didn't want to upset him by asking again. Once he finished retrieving the containers, he went back to his car and returned with more stuff. This time he came back with many bags of food and bottled water. All of the foods were non-perishables, like bread, canned goods, and crackers. Finally, he went downstairs and locked the door. I was confused, but I wasn't very concerned. I began to get alarmed the next day when he still hadn't left his room at all. I knocked on his door, hearing him shout for me to go away. I tried pulling it open, but it wouldn't budge. He must have did something to lock it from the inside. Eventually, my parents got concerned too. They tried to open the door, but Ryan convinced them not to care. He told them that he was an adult and that he had food and water to sustain himself. They gave in, not wanting to argue after a long day of work. I, however, refused to give up. Every day I tried to convince him to get out, but he always yelled at me to go away. Finally, about a month later, I gave up. Another month went by and Ryan still hadn't left his room. None of us tried to get him out since we knew he would just end up yelling at us. During the night, my mind would often wander and think about Ryan. As time went on, my thoughts became more and more paranoid, and I began to get worried. It was around the 2-month mark when I decided enough was enough. I woke up early that morning and couldn't fall back asleep. My parents were working, and it was just me and Ryan at home. I silently crept down the stairs and walked towards the door to Ryan's room. I knocked gently. Silence. I knocked harder but still got no response. I tried calling his name but was still met with silence. I continued to knock, eventually banging at the door. I was getting really scared. I put my ear to the door and noticed something. I heard a noise that sounded like a muffled buzzing. I finally got to a point where I decided I had to force my way in somehow. I went in the garage, retrieved a baseball bat, and headed back to Ryan's door. I struck the door. As the wood broke, I was hit with a horrific stench and a swarm of flies flying out. Suppressing a gag, I turned on my phone's flashlight and headed downstairs. I called my brother's name. "Ryan?" Again, I was met with silence. At this point, the buzzing was deafening. Finally, once I reached the bottom of the stairs, I shined the light. What I saw will haunt my mind forever. Sitting on a computer chair was my brother. He was completely infested. His eyes were red and bloodshot, with parasites swimming about. He was unclothed, covered in deep, bleeding, open wounds filled with squirming maggots. Worms and larvae crawled throughout his body and underneath his skin. Flies swarmed the room and landed all over his body. His light brown hair had grown long and messy, covered with insects. On a desk near his bed were the containers I'd seen. They had contained the insects he had brought down here. He had been living off of the food, ensuring that he survived. I approached my brother. He lay unmoving, his bloodshot eyes glazed over. His chest, however, was still rising and falling. Suddenly, he spoke. "Alex?" I stuttered a reply. Yes, Ryan." He spoke quietly and eerily calm, his voice a rasped whisper. "Do you think Mom and Dad will finally care about me again?" It was at the moment where everything finally made sense. Ryan had felt abandoned since my diagnosis with leukemia. It only worsened as my parents both started working longer hours. And now here he sat, infested and dying, having just a sliver of hope that his parents would finally have a reason to give him attention. Tears were falling down my face now. Of course they will." Barely 20 minutes later, the ambulances arrived. My parents rushed home from work and couldn't stop sobbing once they saw Ryan in his current state. He was rushed to the hospital and died hours later. He had gotten exactly what he hoped for. Mom and Dad are distraught and cannot stop thinking about him. At first, I felt guilty. If it wasn't for my leukemia, he never would have felt neglected. But then, I felt anger. He didn't have to destroy his own body. All he wanted was his parents' attention, and now he isn't even alive to see it. Now, as I stand in front of my brother's grave, I feel nothing but pure emptiness. A hole in my heart that Ryan once filled is now empty. I sighed, looking at my brother's grave. As I stared at his engraved name, I noticed it. A little maggot was crawling down his gravestone.
What disturbing rumor turned out to be true at your school? When I was a senior in high school, we had a new teacher join the faculty to teach health and home economics. She was probably about 26 years old and very, very attractive. Everyone was talking about the hot new teacher. As I was senior class president, I needed a new faculty advisor since my previous advisor of 3 years retired at the end of my junior year. About 2 weeks later, the principal called me into his office and informed me that the new hot teacher was going to be our new class advisor for the rest of the year. As a result, she and I spent a lot of time together, at school and off campus, organizing and running myriad events to raise money for the class, plan the prom, field trips, etc. Soon, the rumors started flying around that she and I were messing around. This was completely false. I can say she never acted inappropriately towards me or suggested anything to make me think she had plans for any type of physical or sexual activity. She was a fantastic advisor and always just that, a class advisor. I spent the rest of the year denying these rumors with friends, with teachers and with parents. I was even interrogated by my wrestling coach the day before the district championship match. She and I had a laugh about it at graduation as she had to face similar questions from other faculty as well as the principal. She confided in me that she had tendered her resignation, but the principal would not accept it and said he believed her and would ensure the rumor was squashed. So I graduated and left for my plebe year at West Point, forgetting about the entire situation. At West Point, the first year is called plebe year rather than freshman year. The first semester of my plebe year was moving along as it should, with no unusual events worth mentioning until the final month. Then, in early December, the topic of my high school faculty advisor resurfaced. One night when I was studying, there was a knock on my door and the company tactical officer, a regular Army captain, walked in and told me to report to his office immediately as there was a phone call for me from the Dover Police Department. Now, I immediately assumed it was my brother playing some kind of twisted joke on me since he was a captain in the very same police department waiting for me on the phone. Since my TAC was standing right behind me, I answered the phone as we were taught. "Cadet Kerwick speaking. How may I help you, sir/ma'am?" I immediately recognized the voice on the other end. It was was not my brother but a close friend I had grown up with and known for over 15 years. He said,
This shadow I saw while showering still scares me to this day. When I was around the age of 11 years old, I was in the bathroom taking my usual shower before bed, as it was the last day of the weekend. I used to close my eyes when I wash my hair after using the shampoo. This one particular night I was showering. I heard the bathroom curtain behind me, like it was moved out of the way to get into the shower, when I heard that noise. I was in the process of washing my hair from the shampoo and my face was full with shampoo. I usually ignore those noises, as I would just assume it's the wind. But this particular noise I heard of the curtain sounded like a human getting in. So out of curiosity and reassurance, I turned around and opened my eyes a bit. When I was just in shock, I saw this red faceless figure like human getting in. I was so shocked that I just stood still in fear. I just stared at it for a good 1 minute to make sure I wasn't just imagining things. Then the thing just went up like it flied and disappeared. After that horrific scene I started shouting for my mom to come in. I told my mom what had happened and she just told me, "I'm imagining things, I'm sure I'm not." What do you guys think? Have I was imagining things or some creature? My experiences in the paranormal. I would say I am very aware of the paranormal and things of that nature. My parents' house is over 100 years old and is next to the Catholic church my mom, brother, and I were baptized at. Now this is where it gets interesting. In the 1950s, during the middle of a sermon, the priest who was living in the house attached to the church was having a heart attack or something of that nature. The people living in the house at the time brought him to their bedroom, what is now our living room, where he later died. Years later, when I was about 8 or 9, I had just woken up from a nap on our recliner in our living room and was still groggy. I remember Mom had a plant in the middle of the doorway for some reason, and as I turned my head to see where I was going when trying to not bump into the plant, for 2 seconds I saw a man without a face, but was wearing a hat. IDK if it was a trucker or baseball cap, but it was a hat, maybe 3 feet in front of me.